The Mont Blanc pen felt heavier than a loaded rifle in Zoe Mitchell's 17-year-old hands. 3 months since Dad's funeral, and she still couldn't write a single word without hearing his voice. Document everything, sweetheart. The truth has a way of surfacing when people think they've buried it deep enough. She clicked the pen closed and slipped it back into her blazer pocket. The same navy blazer that had hung unworn in her closet for 2 years, while Dad promised they'd finally settle somewhere permanent after his one last case. The irony wasn't lost on her that Westbrook High School's dress code required the exact shade of navy he'd worn when the military police delivered the news that Colonel James Mitchell had died in a car accident while investigating defense contractor fraud. Accident. Right. The pristine hallways of Westbrook High stretched before her like something from a glossy brochure. All marble floors and crown molding that screamed old money. Security cameras nestled in every corner. Expensive art hung at precise intervals. And the morning light streaming through tall windows illuminated teenagers who moved with the casual confidence that comes from never wondering if your family can afford next month's rent. Zoe had attended 12 schools in 15 years, following Dad from base to base, and she'd learned to read the social landscape within hours. But this place felt different, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with the usual new kid anxiety and everything to do with the way conversations stopped when adults passed. The way certain students seemed to glide through halls while others pressed against lockers. Her first period chemistry teacher, Dr. Brennan, had that particular smile teachers wore when they'd been briefed about the scholarship kid who needed special attention. The kind of attention that came with lowered expectations wrapped in false kindness. "Miss Mitchell, Dr." Brennan announced as she entered the classroom. "We have a new student joining us from," he glanced at his notes, "multiple military installations. Please, introduce yourself." If you're feeling that rush of what's going to happen next, hit that like button. It really helps more people discover these stories. And if you want to share where you're watching from, drop it in the comments below. For those who want to support more stories like this one, there's a thanks button right under this video. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps me bring you more inspiring tales of courage and standing up for what's right. Thank you for being here. Now, let's see what happens when push comes to shove. 24 pairs of eyes turned toward her, and Zoe felt that familiar weight in her chest. The same feeling she'd had sitting in the military chaplain's office while he explained how heroes sometimes died in unmarked rental cars on rural Virginia highways. "I'm Zoe." She kept her voice steady, a skill learned from years of Dad's friends stopping by to deliver news that changed everything. "My father was Colonel James Mitchell, Judge Advocate General's Corps. We moved here after—" She paused, choosing her words with the precision Dad had taught her. "After his recent passing." Sympathy flickered across a few faces, but she caught something else in the expressions of several students in the back row. Recognition. Not the kind that comes from hearing about a military father's death, but the kind that comes from knowing exactly who Colonel James Mitchell had been investigating when he died. The boy with perfectly styled blonde hair and a watch that cost more than most people's cars leaned over to whisper something to his seatmate, and both of them smirked. "I'm sorry for your loss," Dr. Brennan said, with genuine warmth. "Please, take any open seat." Zoe chose a spot in the middle of the room, close enough to pay attention but far enough from the back row boys to avoid immediate conflict. She'd learned that confrontation was inevitable in new schools, but timing was everything. Chemistry passed without incident, so did AP History, where she impressed Mrs. Chen by referencing the Nuremberg trials when discussing international law. It was during lunch that the carefully maintained civility cracked. The cafeteria was a masterclass in social stratification. Athletes clustered near the windows with the best natural light, obvious for their mandatory photos. Theater kids commanded a corner table, gesturing dramatically over quinoa salads. Academic overachievers hunched over laptops, stress-eating organic trail mix. And in the center, like a court-holding session, sat the unmistakable royalty of Westbrook High. Zoe had seen their type before, but usually on military bases where daddy's rank meant everything until the next promotion cycle humbled the family. Here, there was no rotation, no transfer orders to redistribute power. These kids had ruled this kingdom since kindergarten. She found an empty table near the academic section and unpacked the lunch she'd prepared that morning, a simple sandwich, an apple, and water. No designer smoothie, no artisanal anything that marked the difference between students who belonged and those who were here on borrowed privilege. That's when she heard it. "Look at military Barbie over there," a voice carried from the royal table. Not quite loud enough for teachers to notice, but perfectly audible to half the cafeteria. Daddy's little soldier girl, all alone. Zoe's hand stilled on her water bottle. Dad's voice echoed in her memory. "Let them reveal themselves. Zoe, people who want to hurt others can't help but show you exactly who they are." The blond boy from chemistry was standing now, his voice growing bolder. "I heard her dad died in some pathetic car crash. Couldn't even die like a real soldier." The cafeteria had gone quiet in that particular way that meant everyone was listening while pretending not to. Zoe felt 20 years of military protocol warring with 17 years of being James Mitchell's daughter, the man who'd taught her that justice was worth fighting for even when the odds were stacked against you. She stood slowly, her chair scraping against the floor with deliberate precision. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that comes from watching your father question war criminals. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced." The boy's smirk widened as she approached. He was tall, probably played lacrosse or tennis, with the kind of confidence that had never been tested by real consequences. "I'm Bryce Caldwell," he said, extending his hand with mock politeness. "And you're nobody." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Zoe felt something shift inside her chest. Not the hot rush of anger she'd expected, but the cold, calculating stillness Dad had called mission focus. "Nobody," she repeated, accepting his handshake with a grip just firm enough to surprise him. "That's interesting, because, according to my research last night, your father is Thomas Caldwell, CEO of Meridian Health Systems." Bryce's smirk faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. So, Thomas Caldwell is currently under investigation by the Federal Trade Commission for price-fixing prescription medications. Zoe's voice remained conversational, but she felt the attention of the entire cafeteria shifting. Specifically, cancer treatments that he marked up by 4,000% while cutting coverage for existing patients. The silence was absolute now. "Your father," Zoe continued, still holding Bryce's increasingly uncomfortable gaze, "testified before Congress last year that families facing terminal diagnoses should explore more cost-effective treatment options. I believe his exact quote was that premium health care is a privilege, not a right." Bryce's face was flushing red, but Zoe wasn't finished. "So when you call me nobody, I want to make sure I understand correctly. Are you suggesting that being the daughter of a man who died investigating corruption makes me less valuable than being the son of a man who profits from other people's suffering?" The question dropped like a stone into still water, sending ripples through the cafeteria. Several students had their phones out now. not to record a typical cafeteria confrontation, but to fact-check what Zoe had just said in real time. Bryce opened his mouth, then closed it, his practiced arrogance crumbling as he realized that his usual social weapons were useless against someone who'd armed herself with truth. "You don't know what you're talking about," he managed, but his voice lacked conviction. "Don't I?" Zoe tilted her head slightly, a gesture she'd inherited from Dad during his most devastating cross-examinations. "Because I spent last night reading SEC filings, FTC complaints, and congressional testimony transcripts. It's amazing what you can learn when you know how to research public records." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the watching crowd. "My father taught me that the most dangerous people are those who mistake power for worth, money for morality. He died because he refused to let powerful men cover up their crimes." Her voice grew quieter, forcing everyone to lean in to hear. "So when someone like you calls me nobody, I can't help but wonder what you're so afraid I might discover." The cafeteria erupted in whispers and the rapid-fire tapping of fingers on phone screens. Bryce stood frozen, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and something that looked suspiciously like fear. But Zoe wasn't watching Bryce anymore. She was studying the adults who'd suddenly appeared at the cafeteria's edges: Dr. Brennan, Mrs. Chen, and two people she didn't recognize, all wearing expressions that suggested this conversation had gone far beyond typical teenage drama. One of the unknown adults, a woman in an expensive suit with the kind of smile that never reached her eyes, approached with the measured steps of someone accustomed to managing crises. "Miss Mitchell," the woman said, her voice warm with artificial authority. "I'm Dr. Sarah Harrington, Westbrook's principal. Perhaps we could continue this discussion in my office." Zoe felt the familiar tingle at the base of her skull that Dad had taught her to recognize. The same sensation he'd described feeling when opposing counsel started making procedural objections to avoid uncomfortable facts entering evidence. "Of course," Zoe replied, but she didn't move immediately. Instead, she turned back to Bryce, who was still standing with his mouth slightly open, looking like someone had just explained calculus to him in ancient Greek. "I'm sorry if I upset you, Bryce," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I know how difficult it must be to carry the weight of your family's reputation." The apology sounded genuine to anyone not listening carefully. But Zoe could see in Bryce's eyes that he'd caught the subtle emphasis on weight and reputation. It wasn't comfort she was offering, it was a promise that she was just getting started. As she followed Dr. Harrington from the cafeteria, Zoe's mind was already racing ahead, cataloging observations and questions with the methodical precision Dad had drilled into her since childhood. Why had Dr. Harrington appeared so quickly? How had she known exactly what was happening in a cafeteria she wasn't supervising? And why did the other adults look less concerned about student conflict and more worried about damage control? The hallway leading to the administrative offices was lined with photographs of distinguished alumni, Westbrook's proudest achievements displayed like trophies. Senators, CEOs, federal judges, all beaming from expensive frames with the kind of smiles that suggested they'd never doubted their place in the world. "Impressive, isn't it?" Dr. Harrington said, noticing Zoe's attention to the photos. "Westbrook has a long tradition of producing leaders." "What kind of leaders?" Zoe asked, pausing in front of a photo dated 15 years earlier. The nameplate read Thomas Caldwell, class of 1995, Meridian Health Systems founder. Dr. Harrington's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Successful ones." They reached the principal's office, and Dr. Harrington gestured for Zoe to take a seat in one of two leather chairs facing an imposing mahogany desk. The office was designed to intimidate, with its dark wood paneling, heavy curtains, and strategically placed diplomas that established Dr. Harrington's credentials without saying a word. But Zoe had spent her childhood in the offices of military commanders, federal prosecutors, and defense attorneys. She recognized the psychology of institutional power, and she wasn't impressed. "Miss Mitchell," Dr. Harrington began, settling behind her desk with practiced authority. "I understand you've experienced a significant loss recently, and I want you to know that Westbrook is committed to supporting our students through difficult transitions." The words were carefully chosen. Zoe noted, supportive but vague, acknowledging her father's death without admitting any institutional responsibility for what had just occurred. "However," Dr. Harrington continued, "I'm concerned about what happened in the cafeteria, making accusations about other students' families, especially accusations based on," she paused delicately, "incomplete information can be very damaging to our school community." Zoe felt something cold settle in her stomach. This wasn't a disciplinary conversation about cafeteria disruption. This was a warning. "Incomplete information," Zoe repeated carefully. "Well, yes. You see, when young people suffer trauma, it's not uncommon for them to—" Dr. Harrington searched for the right words, "misinterpret situations, or to see conspiracy where there might simply be coincidence." The psychology was textbook, Zoe realized. Discredit the source by questioning their mental state. Frame their legitimate concerns as symptoms of grief-induced paranoia. Dad had warned her about this tactic when explaining how powerful people protected themselves from accountability. "Dr. Harrington," Zoe said, keeping her voice respectfully curious, "are you suggesting that the FTC investigation into Meridian Health Systems is a coincidence I've misinterpreted?" A flicker of something passed across the principal's face, too quickly to identify. But Dr. Harrington's smile never wavered. "I'm suggesting that a young woman who's recently lost her father might be particularly sensitive to perceived injustices, and that sensitivity could lead to unfortunate misunderstandings." The silence stretched between them, and Zoe found herself thinking about the last conversation she'd had with Dad. He'd been packing for what he'd called a routine deposition, but his hands had been shaking slightly as he'd organized his files. "Zoe," he'd said, not looking up from his briefcase, "if anything happens to me, I need you to remember something. The most dangerous criminals are the ones who've learned to hide behind institutions. They'll use those institutions to discredit anyone who threatens their power." At the time, she'd thought he was being overly dramatic. Now, sitting in Dr. Harrington's office while being psychologically evaluated for having the audacity to fact-check a bully, she understood exactly what he'd meant. "I appreciate your concern for my emotional well-being," Zoe said finally. "But I'm curious about something else. How did you know what was happening in the cafeteria so quickly? Do you monitor student conversations regularly? Or was someone particularly concerned about today's discussion?" Dr. Harrington's professional mask slipped just enough to reveal a flash of irritation before reassembling itself. "Westbrook takes all student welfare seriously, Miss Mitchell. We have protocols in place to address situations that might—" She paused again, choosing her words with legal precision. "Escalate beyond normal teenage disagreements. Protocols for when students discuss public information about other students' families. Protocols for when students make inflammatory statements that could be considered harassment." Zoe leaned forward slightly, engaging the same focused attention she'd inherited from Dad during depositions. "So, to clarify, citing public congressional testimony and SEC filings constitutes harassment, but calling someone nobody and mocking their dead father doesn't—" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Zoe watched Dr. Harrington's face carefully. She'd learned from Dad that people revealed more in the pause before answering than in the answer itself. "Miss Mitchell?" Dr. Harrington said finally, her voice carrying a note of finality that suggested the conversation was over. "I think it would be best if you took the remainder of the day to settle in. Perhaps speak with our school counselor about healthy ways to process your grief. Tomorrow, we'll start fresh with a better understanding of Westbrook's community standards." It was a dismissal wrapped in therapeutic language. But Zoe heard the real message clearly. Stop asking questions. Stop making connections. Stop being inconvenient. She stood slowly, recognizing the meeting's end, but not quite ready to surrender the field. "Dr. Harrington," she said, pausing at the office door, "when my father was investigating military contractors, he always said the cover-up was worse than the crime. People who had nothing to hide never worried about questions being asked." She didn't wait for a response. Stepping into the hallway with the distinct feeling that she'd just declared war on an enemy, she was only beginning to understand. As she walked back toward her locker, Zoe's mind was already cataloging the pieces of a puzzle that was bigger than Bryce Caldwell's cafeteria cruelty. Dr. Harrington's reaction, the speed of administrative response, the careful legal language around inflammatory statements versus harassment. But it was the photo in the hallway that kept drawing her attention back. Thomas Caldwell, class of 1995, smiling confidently from his place among Westbrook's distinguished alumni. What were the odds that the father of her cafeteria tormentor was also a graduate of the very school where she was now being warned about asking inconvenient questions? Zoe pulled out her phone and quickly typed a text to the only number she trusted completely, her father's former paralegal, Maria Santos, who'd promised to help with anything Zoe needed after the funeral. "Maria, need help researching Westbrook High School Board of Directors, major donors, and any connections to Meridian Health Systems. Also need background on Principal Sarah Harrington. Can you access Dad's investigative databases?" The response came back within minutes. "Already on it. Your dad would be proud. Be careful. Mija, some stones are too big to turn over alone." As Zoe closed her locker and headed for the parking lot where her elderly Honda waited among BMWs and Mercedes, she felt the weight of her father's Montblanc pen in her blazer pocket. Dad had died investigating corruption that reached into the highest levels of military contracting. Now, she was discovering that the same patterns of power, protection, and intimidation existed in the halls of an elite private school. The question wasn't whether Westbrook High School was hiding something. The question was how deep the corruption went, and whether a 17-year-old military daughter with a pen and a passion for justice could expose it before they found a way to silence her too. Tomorrow, she decided, she'd start asking the questions that Dr. Harrington clearly didn't want answered. After all, nobody had taught her that documentation was everything, and if they thought calling her nobody would make her disappear, they'd severely underestimated James Mitchell's daughter. Maria Santos called back at 11 that night, her voice carrying the same urgency Zoe remembered from Dad's late-night strategy sessions. "Mija, you need to be very careful. Westbrook isn't just a school. It's a money laundering operation disguised as education." Zoe sat on her bed, laptop open, surrounded by printed documents that Maria had somehow accessed and sent within hours. Financial records, board meeting minutes, donor lists that read like a who's who of Connecticut's most questionable business leaders. "What do you mean, money laundering?" "Look at page 15, Maria said. "The Caldwell Family Foundation donated $2.3 million to Westbrook last year. But according to the IRS filings I pulled, they claimed a $4 million tax deduction. The difference went somewhere, and I guarantee it wasn't into educational programs. Zoe flipped through the papers, her father's training kicking in as she began connecting dots that formed a picture uglier than simple teenage bullying. "The board of directors," she murmured, scanning the names. "Thomas Caldwell, chair. Richard Harrington. That must be Dr. Harrington's husband. Dr. Vasquez sits on the disciplinary committee, but isn't voting board member. Keep reading. Look at the scholarship recipients." Zoe found the list and felt her stomach drop. According to Westbrook's public website, they provided full scholarships to 15 students from underserved communities each year. According to the internal documents Maria had uncovered, only 3 scholarships had been awarded in the past 4 years. Where did the scholarship money go? Grade changes, SAT score adjustments, college admission consulting for board members' kids. Your father was investigating similar schemes in military academies when he died. The pattern is identical. The room felt suddenly cold, despite the October heat still radiating from her laptop. Dad hadn't died in a random car accident. He'd been getting too close to something that connected military corruption with civilian education fraud. "Maria, was Westbrook on Dad's investigation list?" Silence stretched across the phone line before Maria answered. "He had a file marked Connecticut Educational Targets. I never saw the contents, but after his death, someone came to collect his files. Someone with federal credentials I couldn't verify." Zoe's hands tightened on the phone. "What kind of someone?" "The kind that makes you realize your boss died because he was about to expose something bigger than military contracts." Sleep became impossible after that call. Zoe spent the hours before dawn researching everything she could find about Westbrook's recent history, cross-referencing names from the board with federal investigation records, tracking donation patterns that suggested coordination between multiple corrupt institutions. By morning, she had built the foundation of a case that would have made Dad proud. But she also understood why he'd been killed for getting this close to the truth. The next day at school, Zoe felt the weight of surveillance from the moment she entered the building. Not the obvious staring of curious teenagers, but the subtle attention of adults who'd been briefed about the problem she represented. Dr. Brennan avoided eye contact during chemistry. Mrs. Chen assigned a pop quiz that kept students too busy to talk. Even the hallway cameras seemed to track her movement with mechanical precision. But it was during lunch that Zoe met the person who would change everything. She was sitting alone again, deliberately this time, when a woman in a custodial uniform approached her table carrying a spray bottle and cleaning cloth. "Mind if I clean around you, honey?" the woman asked, her voice carrying traces of a southern accent and something else Zoe couldn't identify. "Of course." The woman began wiping down empty chairs with methodical precision, but as she worked, she spoke quietly without looking at Zoe directly. "Name's Ms. Patterson. Been cleaning these halls for 3 years now, but I used to teach constitutional law at Howard University before my husband's medical bills forced a career change." Zoe's head snapped up, but Ms. Patterson continued cleaning, as if discussing the weather. "Funny thing about being invisible," Ms. Patterson continued. "People say things around janitors they'd never say around teachers. Board meetings, parent conferences, disciplinary hearings, they all happen in rooms that need cleaning." She moved to the next table, still speaking just loud enough for Zoe to hear. "Your daddy was a smart man, asking the right questions about education fraud. Shame he didn't live to see his work finished." The words hit Zoe like a physical blow. "You knew my father, knew of him. Constitutional lawyers don't forget cases like Colonel Mitchell versus Blackwater Educational Services. He proved they were selling military training contracts to schools that didn't exist. Pocketing federal funds meant for veteran education programs. Miss Patterson finished cleaning and moved closer, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. Same playbook here. Child. Different victims. Same criminals. Meet me in the east stairwell after last period if you want to know what really happened to the scholarship students who transferred out. She walked away before Zoe could respond, leaving behind the lingering scent of industrial cleaner and the most dangerous feeling Zoe had experienced since Dad's death hope. The east stairwell at 3:47 p.m. was empty, except for Ms. Patterson, who sat on the bottom step with a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse. Before we start, Ms. Patterson said without preamble, you need to understand what you're asking for. Your daddy died because he got too close to people with too much money and too little conscience. You keep digging. You might follow the same path. Zoe sat down beside her, thinking about the Mont Blanc pen in her pocket and the promise she'd made at Dad's graveside. He always said the truth was worth dying for. I think it's worth living for, too. Miss Patterson smiled for the first time, an expression that transformed her entire face. Your daddy raised you right. Let me show you what 3 years of invisible listening gets you. The folder contained photocopied documents, handwritten notes, and photographs that painted a picture of systematic fraud reaching back nearly a decade. Scholarship funds diverted to private accounts. Grades changed for students whose parents made building fund donations. Test scores altered by administrators with access to secure databases. But the most damning evidence was a series of voice recordings Ms. Patterson had made during board meetings, using a small digital recorder hidden in her cleaning cart. This one's from last month, she said, pressing play on a small device. Thomas Caldwell's voice filled the stairwell, crisp and arrogant. The Mitchell girl is a problem we need to solve quickly. Her father was getting too close to our Connecticut operations before his accident, and she has his investigative instincts. Another voice, which Zoe recognized as Dr. Harrington. We can't simply expel her without cause. Her scholarship status gives her certain protections. Then manufacture cause, Caldwell replied coldly. Have Bryce escalate the harassment until she retaliates. Once she's labeled as violent or unstable, we can remove her and discredit any allegations she might make. The recording continued, but Zoe's mind was reeling. They weren't just covering up fraud. They were actively planning to destroy her using her father's own son as a weapon. Ms. Patterson, Zoe said when the recording ended, how many other students have they done this to? 15 in the past 3 years. Kids who asked too many questions, performed too well academically, or came from families without the resources to fight back. She pulled out another set of documents, these bearing official letterhead from various colleges and universities. Jordan Rivers was supposed to start at Yale this fall on a full scholarship. Mathematics prodigy, first in their family to attend college. But after they came out as transgender, suddenly their grades started declining, and their scholarship recommendations disappeared. Zoe studied Jordan's academic records, noting the dramatic drop in performance that coincided exactly with their transition announcement. Where's Jordan now? Community college in New Haven. Working nights to pay tuition. Dreams deferred indefinitely. The injustice of it burned in Zoe's chest like acid. She thought about Dad's final case, about all the students whose futures had been stolen by adults who treated education like a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. Ms. Patterson, how would you feel about helping me destroy these people? Child, I've been waiting 3 years for someone with the skills and resources to do exactly that. Over the next 2 weeks, Zoe and Ms. Patterson built a case that would have impressed federal prosecutors, using Dad's old contacts and Maria Santos's research capabilities. They documented financial fraud, civil rights violations, and RICO conspiracy charges that could send the entire Westbrook board to federal prison. But the personal cost was escalating daily. Bryce's harassment had intensified exactly as his father had planned. Cyber attacks on her social media, anonymous threats slipped into her locker, and a coordinated campaign of social isolation that left her eating lunch alone while former acquaintances avoided eye contact. The psychological pressure was designed to break her, and Zoe could feel it working. Sleep became elusive, concentration during classes nearly impossible, and the hypervigilance Dad had taught her for survival now felt like paranoia. It was during one particularly brutal week that Zoe discovered something that changed her understanding of the entire situation. She was researching Bryce's family medical history for additional fraud patterns when she stumbled across hospital records that Maria had accessed through Dad's old Department of Defense connections. Emma Caldwell, age 12, diagnosed with severe autism requiring specialized therapy. Treatment costs $400,000 annually, covered through her father's corporate health insurance plan. Thomas Caldwell's testimony to Congress suddenly made horrific sense. He wasn't just denying health care to strangers, he was ensuring his own family's coverage by making treatment unaffordable for everyone else. But more than that, Zoe realized that Bryce's cruelty wasn't just inherited privilege. It was a desperate attempt to maintain his father's approval and protect his sister's access to life-changing medical care. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Bryce wasn't just a bully, he was another victim of his father's systematic corruption, weaponized against other vulnerable students to protect the only family member he truly cared about. That night, Zoe made a decision that would have shocked everyone who knew her. Instead of heading home after school, she waited by Bryce's BMW in the parking lot. He approached warily, clearly expecting another confrontation, but stopped when he saw her expression. "I know about Emma," Zoe said simply. Bryce's face went white, then red, then settled into something that looked like resignation. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Your sister, 12 years old, autism spectrum, requires intensive therapy that costs more than most people make in a decade." Zoe kept her voice gentle, the same tone Dad used when interviewing victims instead of perpetrators. "I know your father told you to escalate harassment against me until I retaliated violently." Bryce's hands began shaking, and for the first time since she'd met him, Zoe saw past the careful armor of arrogance to the terrified 17-year-old underneath. He said if I couldn't control one scholarship girl, how could I ever run a company? Bryce's voice cracked slightly. "Emma needs her treatments. If Dad goes to prison, she'll lose her insurance coverage," Zoe finished, "and you'll lose the only family member who actually loves you." The accuracy of her assessment broke something in Bryce's carefully constructed defenses. He slumped against his car, looking younger than his 17 years. "I never wanted to hurt anyone, but Emma, she's getting better. The therapy is working. If she loses treatment now..." Zoe felt the familiar weight of her father's moral compass guiding her toward a decision that would define the kind of person she chose to become. "Bryce, what if I told you there was a way to save Emma and stop your father from destroying other families?" He looked up with the desperate hope of someone drowning who'd just been thrown a rope. "What do you mean?" "I mean cooperating with federal investigators instead of protecting the system that turned you into a weapon against other students." Over the next hour, sitting in Bryce's BMW in an empty school parking lot, Zoe outlined a plan that would satisfy justice while protecting the innocent. Immunity for Bryce in exchange for testimony about his father's crimes, medical coverage for Emma through victim compensation funds, and most importantly, systemic change that would prevent other families from facing the same impossible choices. "You're offering to save my sister in exchange for my father's freedom," Bryce said finally. "I'm offering to save your sister by ensuring your father can never again use healthcare as a weapon against families like yours." The distinction mattered, and they both knew it. 3 days later, FBI agents arrived at Westbrook High School with search warrants for the administrative offices, board meeting records, and financial documents dating back 7 years. Thomas Caldwell was arrested at his corporate headquarters on charges of mail fraud, tax evasion, and civil rights violations. Dr. Harrington was taken into custody during third-period AP history, her stunned expression visible through the classroom windows as federal agents escorted her past students who finally understood that adult authority could be held accountable. The local news coverage was extensive but careful, focusing on financial crimes rather than the human cost of systematic discrimination. But Zoe didn't need media validation to know that justice had been served. 6 months later, Westbrook High School had new administration, genuine scholarship programs, and transparent complaint procedures that actually protected students instead of silencing them. Jordan Rivers was back at Yale, their deferred dreams finally restored through a legal settlement that included full tuition reimbursement and academic record correction. Bryce Caldwell spent his senior year in counseling and community service, using his family's remaining connections to advocate for healthcare reform that would prevent insurance companies from holding sick children hostage to their parents' cooperation. And Zoe Mitchell established the Colonel James Mitchell Foundation for Educational Justice, providing legal advocacy for students facing discrimination at private institutions nationwide. But, perhaps most importantly, she learned that true justice wasn't about revenge against individual bullies. It was about changing systems that created bullies in the first place. On graduation day, as Zoe walked across the stage to receive her diploma, she carried her father's Mont Blanc pen in her blazer pocket and a letter of acceptance to Georgetown Law School in her other hand. In the audience, Ms. Patterson applauded with tears in her eyes. Having recently been hired as Westbrook's new Director of Student Advocacy, a position created specifically to ensure that no student would ever again suffer in silence. Bryce sat 3 rows behind her, his cap decorated with a small ribbon in autism awareness colors. They weren't friends, might never be friends, but they'd learned something valuable about the difference between accountability and destruction. As Principal Rodriguez, Dr. Harrington's replacement and a former civil rights attorney, called her name, Zoe thought about the conversation she'd had with Dad's gravestone the week before. "I kept my promise," she'd whispered to the marble headstone bearing his name. "The truth surfaced, just like you said it would, and nobody had to die for it this time." The Mont Blanc pen felt lighter in her pocket as she accepted her diploma. No longer a burden of unfinished justice, but a tool for continuing the work that mattered. Because she'd learned that the most powerful response to being called nobody wasn't proving them wrong, it was proving that everybody deserved to be somebody, and systems that demanded otherwise deserved to be dismantled with precision, patience, and the kind of relentless truth-telling that changed the world one institution at a time. After all, she was James Mitchell's daughter, and nobody had taught her that documentation was everything. But more than that, she'd taught herself that justice was everything worth documenting. 5 years later, Zoe stood before a congressional subcommittee on education fraud, her father's Mont Blanc pen poised over testimony that would extend federal oversight to private schools nationwide. "Senators," she began, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that had once challenged a cafeteria bully. "Systematic discrimination in education doesn't end with graduation. It echoes through generations, determining who gets opportunities and who gets excuses." In the gallery behind her sat Jordan Rivers, now a Yale graduate working for the Department of Education. Ms. Patterson, whose legal advocacy program had been replicated in 12 states. Even Bryce Caldwell, whose healthcare reform organization had saved countless families from impossible choices. "My father taught me that justice isn't about individual victories," Zoe continued, glancing at the committee members who would decide the fate of her proposed legislation. "It's about building systems that make those victories unnecessary." As she outlined the Mitchell Educational Accountability Act, Zoe thought about the scared 17-year-old who'd walked into Westbrook High School carrying grief and a pen. That girl had believed she was nobody. This woman knew she was everybody's advocate. And the difference between those two truths was everything worth fighting for.